So with all of the questions in your GCSE English Literature, with the exception of unseen poetry, you are being tested on these 3 assessment objectives. Assessment objective 1 expects that you understand the text that you have studied, that you are able to develop a personal response to that text while still maintaining that academic distance. You need to be able to use quotations and references to the text to support your ideas. Within that, for assessment objective 2, you need to look at what the writer is doing, look at how they are using specific language techniques or structure to create meanings and what message they are trying to get across to you. And then finally, you need to base all of that in the context in which the text was written. So how does that affect what is happening? Today we're going to be focusing on Blood Brothers. So we have a play that spans several decades, but focuses quite specifically on class inequality and nature versus nurture. So in paper 2, you will have 24 questions put out in front of you. You need to find the text that you have studied and you need to only answer one of those questions. From the first 24 questions in paper 2, you only answer one question. For the modern text, you will be given a choice of questions, and generally you will have a choice between a character-based question or a theme-based question. So this is what you could be looking at. How does Russell present the ways Mickey and Edward are affected by their different upbringings? So you have that character, but also the theme there. And then Russell shows in Blood Brothers that privilege does not always lead to happiness. How far do you agree with this view? Again, the theme here, the clear theme, is about that class inequality, but also about whether that leads to happiness or not. So first thing we're going to do is look at the Mickey and Edward question. So we know that they have different upbringings. We know that there are different expectations on the two of them. So Mickey is raised in poverty with lots of siblings. They have different educational experiences. Edward has privilege and expectation. They are viewed differently by people. Ultimately, however, at the end of the play, it is a tragedy for both. So they've had different experiences of childhood, and yet ultimately they have ended up in the same place. So we now need to look at what quotations we could use to write this, and we need to look at what we're going to be saying. So if we go back to the question quickly, how does Russell present the ways Mickey and Edward are affected by their different upbringings? Both boys experience different childhoods, which leads to them having different views. Unfortunately, however, the play ends tragically for them both, suggesting that whilst nurture is important, there is also something about our nature that we can't escape. So if you look at that, our thesis statement identifies the fact that they have different upbringings, identifies the fact that for both of them the play ends tragically, and therefore looks at one of the key themes in the play of nature versus nurture, and has already identified that whilst nurture is massively important because this is what leads to them having different experiences of childhood, the nature element of it brings Edward back into that fold and means that he cannot escape his tragic end. If we now do the same thing for the other question, Russell shows in Blood Brothers that privilege does not always lead to happiness. How far do you agree with this view? We're then going to look at the different characters, and we then have to look not only at Mickey and Edward, but also at Mrs. Johnson and Mrs. Lyons. So, Mrs. Lyons has privilege, but is angry, miserable, and vindictive. Partly because the one thing that she does not have access to is the one thing that she feels should be natural to her, which is a child. If we look at Mrs. Johnstone, she has very little money, but is more cheerful, more comfortable in herself, and more optimistic. If we look at Edward, he is self-confident, he is largely happy, but doesn't get love. If we look at Mickey, he has no confidence, is marred in depression, and therefore loses the positive in his life because he is not in a position to take advantage of it. So him and Linda love each other, they are together, but because of his insecurities as a result of his upbringing, because of his depression as a result of his upbringing, he is not able to grab hold of that positive. So if we look at the question being about privilege not always leading to happiness, we can see that actually Edward is self-confident, is generally happy, but is always looking for something more. Mrs. Johnson, who has nothing, comes across as the more confident, the happier character. And so actually, the answer to that question is that privilege does not lead to happiness, and that some of that is about the characters in and of themselves. So Russell shows us that privilege is not a guarantee of happiness, whilst Edward could be said to be a more happy character. He is still negatively affected by those goes around him and does not get the love that he wants. So we could have that as our thesis statement. That thesis statement obviously focuses on Edward. He is the more complex of the characters because on the surface he is happy, he is self-confident, he looks after Mickey, he looks after Linda. However, there is always this sort of underlying sense of what he doesn't have or what he is missing, which is not balanced out by his privilege. What you should do now is, for both of those essay questions, have a go at writing that introduction. So, privilege leading to happiness and the different outcomes for Mickey and Edward.